Hello everyone, and welcome back to Nailing Your Thesis. We will continue our work on examples. We just looked at a research example in the previous session, and now we will look at how to write a research paper, a publication that summarizes the results of such work. And this is quite important because if you cannot properly explain, summarize your research work, you will not be understood, and if you're not understood right, nobody will know about the high quality of the work you did, which in the case of final theses probably means getting a lower grade than might be proper for your work. Research papers and also final theses, in my opinion, in computer science and information systems, and I think also beyond, follow a pattern, a regular structure. 95% of all research work has or should have a form like this, where a research paper is that publication, maybe 10 or 20 pages of writing, which have and structured into these sections. You can see 11 sections. Not all of them are mandatory, and sometimes they vary by the title, but basically these pieces, these parts need to be there, and they constitute a full-blown publishable research paper. You need a title. You need to identify the work to give readers a hint what it's about. You need the author list. It's quite important. This is the set of people that will get academic credit for the work. So everyone who made an intellectual contribution, non-trivial intellectual contribution to the advancement in the state of knowledge as presented by this paper, should be on the author list. On the author list should not be people who just did legwork but did not contribute to the actual intellectual progress. Then follows the abstract, a summary of the research paper. In total volume, it's just a small part of the paper, 1%, 2% in terms of number of words, but it's critical for making people want to read your work. People notice your work by the title. They decide whether to read your work, the full paper of 10 to 20 pages, after reading the abstract. So the abstract needs to be on target, needs to be very concise, needs to be compelling potential readers to become actual real readers of your work. Next is the introduction, putting the research work into context. Next is the related work section, which, following a contrast and compare approach, will show how your work relates to other work and also how it's different from other work so that it warrants publication. Next is the theory or research question, which explains what you are after and how you framed it. 7 is validation or research results. What did you find with respect to the question you posed in the previous section? Next is limitations. No research is ever universally valid and true. There are always some limitations, sometimes known ones, sometimes unknown ones. So you need to address those explicitly. Having limitations is not bad. It simply means that you understand your work. And finally, you conclude the paper with a summary or an outlook on future work, acknowledgments, and finally the references section, as your writing involves lots of references to other works that need to be added at the end. So then, going back to the example on is open source sustainable, is open source alive, and will it be alive in the future? A title for the paper could be, is open source sustainable? Shorter is better, so I put down here is open source sustainable, which is less precise than is it alive and will it stay alive, but it's a title. It's only supposed to make people look, not to be a precise and complete summary of the paper. You need an author list. So in this case, I'm the only author. I wrote the paper, I conceived the research, carried it out. And next follows the abstract. An abstract should not be that much longer than this. Sometimes people go longer. I don't like it. Many people don't like long abstracts. Try to keep them short. We will look at patterns of writing successful abstracts because they are so important. You need to draw in the reader. The abstract is also where the keywords are for search engines. So you need to have a pattern of or something like what's the context of the research, what are the key findings, why should a reader believe it's not just hyperbole, but you actually show the key findings are true, and maybe what follows from that, why is it important in the sense of motivating further research. Then begins, after the abstract, begins the first real, fully written section, if you will, of the paper, the introduction. The introduction, and we will look at this at much more detail later on, but for now, the introduction needs to provide context. What is the research you're doing and why is it important? Then what will you be answering? Of which, what's the question you'll be answering and what are your findings? And that is particularly important because people read articles, papers, with a pattern mindset. They will be looking for cues to read articles fast. And the critical aspect is that almost every paper now has some paragraph in the introduction where it says the contributions of this article are. And then follows a list of shortly formulated, as precise as possible contributions made by that research work. If you find yourself being vague on what your contributions are, you probably did not do your research properly. Anyway, it depends on how broadly you need to start to provide context because the audience varies by publication outlet. In highly specialized journals, you can assume more of an understanding of your domain of research than in broader journals or even magazines that are trying to reach out to the broader population. So keep that in mind where you're trying to publish as to how broadly you need to start and what assumptions you can make about your work. People sometimes argue that abstract and introduction are written after you've done your research work. I'm not so sure. I sometimes use writing an abstract, writing an introduction as a way of planning out research in my head as well from the perspective of performing it well in such a way that it's publishable. If I stumble over the contributions part and it's not precise, I know that in my planning something's wrong and I may have to rethink it. After the introduction, there always or almost always is the related work section. The related work section tries to put your work into a context of other research work. The introduction put your work into the general context. Here you try to compare and contrast your work with competing researchers' work or other forms of research that's relevant for you. And compare and contrast typically means you say, so-and-so performed the following research with these results. Our work finds the same results but adds something over it, or our work contradicts it, or something like it, which shows how you relate, maybe in terms of similar findings or similar research questions but different findings, and also always contrasts your work, showing how there's a difference between what those guys have done and what you're doing in order to motivate, yes, it's worth publishing your work because there's something new in it. After you've set the stage, if you will, you now move on to the research question or theory. You explain in more detail what research question you're asking. This includes, more often than not, an operationalization. So first of all, hypotheses and then an operationalization of the terms without any particular data you may have yet. You're really just explaining what you are asking and where you want to go. And then the next section actually presents the results of the work you did. So you asked the question in the previous section, and then you did all your analysis, and now you present the results. There may be or may not be, if it's too trivial, a section on the approach and how you did all that data gathering and cleaning, but it is always results oriented. This is quite hard for students to understand. Many students will want to get credit for the hard work they put in, the many hours. Science is cruel. Science doesn't care about how many hours you put in. Science only cares as to, did you learn something that we didn't already know? Some people are lucky with small amounts of work and the right question and some luck. They get great data, great progress with minimal work, and some are unlucky, spending hours in the lab, hours data gathering data, cleaning it with no discernible result. That's how it is. You may still ask your professor for a final thesis, please give me credit for effort, but if it comes to publishing a research paper in the context of the scientific community, there is no credit for effort. Only results count. That's why in a research paper aimed at a real scientific audience, you go from here's the question to here are the results quite quickly, omitting the possibly huge amount of work that happened in between. It may feel unfair, but that's how it is. Nobody wants to know how much you suffered in the lab unless there are some valuable lessons there. There's simply no publication for effort, there's only publication for results. Now that you have presented your research question and you have presented the results for it, you will have to discuss them. Already in the presentation of the results, of course, you may point to limits in what you can conclude for it, but there's so many issues often with data and data gathering that you actually create an extra section for it where you show how far you can generalize and where you can't generalize, since we're always interested in generalizable conclusions, in this case about how open source is alive or not, is sustainable or not. And so in this example, now our research question was, is open source sustainable or not? The results are, we have this time series of active open source projects, and there are active projects, and it keeps growing. So we conclude it is open source is alive and will stay alive, so it is sustainable. But when you look closer, you will see that we used a sample, or we have to disclose that we used a sample and not the overall population. Then we need to discuss whether the sample is really representative of the overall population so that we can conclude on the overall population. We will need to look at our measures. Could people quibble with our definition of active open source projects? We may have to look at whether the data is actually good. Very often there are data quality issues in the data, even though we hope it would say something precisely, it does not say something precisely because it's just confused or was poorly collected, or there were algorithm problems or bugs simply in the software collecting this data from the web, etc., etc. And next to limitations, there are also sometimes interesting conclusions or issues or speculations about future work. So not all of this is negative in the sense of showing limitations and reducing the power of your results. There are also sometimes interesting sparks, interesting insights for future research. Now, if you feel that you need to be skimping, you need to be keeping the section down, that's actually not true. The good researcher understands their limitations, and there's nothing wrong with spelling them all out. In fact, it's simply good science to do so. You should not skip it. And if you can do it properly, it will only add to the believability of the research results, because showing how well you understand the limitations shows that you probably carried out your research work with sufficient rigor, which again is an indication to reviewers that your work warrants publishing. So then you conclude the paper after showing your explaining your question, showing your results and answering the question, and showing the limitations of those answers. You conclude typically by summarizing again what you learned, including key limitations perhaps. You may point to future work that are a conclusion of what you learned or simply things you want to do, and then you're basically done with the paper. The small stuff at the end: acknowledge those people who performed work that was not considered an intellectual contribution, but just lag work, in an acknowledgement section, as you can see here. This is a former PhD student of mine. It's debatable whether he actually made an intellectual contribution. I'd be happy to have him as an author. In general, you should probably be rather generous rather than too skippy. For demonstration purposes, I simply reduced his contribution to some programming work for gathering the data following a specification that I gave him. And finally, there are the references. We will look at how to find this research work. We will look at how to cite it and how to format it to put it into this final references section of a paper. Well, what did we learn? We learned the basic structure and content of a research paper. And again, 99% of all research papers somehow follow that pattern. And if you're not following that pattern, you better have a good reason for it, because reviewers, readers will expect that pattern. They are trained to recognize that pattern, and if they don't, they may more easily be dismissive of your work rather than receptive. So really have a good reason if you can't follow that pattern. That's it for now. Thank you very much, and I will see you in a bit.